I could buy this whole place with a snap of my fingers. James Langford's voice rang out through the expensive, quiet restaurant like a sharp crack of thunder in a storm. He was used to being in control. He was a billionaire after all. But what he didn't expect was that his words would have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. The polished tables gleamed under the soft amber lights. Crystal glasses caught the light, and the soft clinking of silverware filled the air. Yet, in the moment his voice cut through the calm, everything seemed to freeze. A few diners glanced around nervously, and the waitstaff held their breath, unsure whether to intervene. Tasha Collins, a black waitress who had been serving the high-profile guests all evening, stood at the side, unnoticed as usual, her back straight and her hands steady despite the tension that gripped the room. But the words, those biting words, had struck a nerve. James Langford, CEO of Langford Enterprises, sat back in his chair with a smirk on his face, unaware of the storm he had just kicked up. To him, she was just another employee, someone meant to serve him, to keep out of his way, someone whose voice didn't matter. And yet, there she stood. Tasha had been trained to ignore the sneers, the dismissive gestures, the subtle racism that came with her job. She had heard it all before, and it didn't bother her. Or so she thought. But tonight was different. There was something about the way James spoke, the way he treated her and everyone else around her like pawns, that cut deeper than the usual insults. And she wasn't about to let it slide. With a calmness that shocked even herself, Tasha walked to his table. Her eyes were steady, and her posture didn't betray a hint of fear. She had nothing to lose, after all. The moment her footsteps echoed across the marble floor, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. James, too, glanced up, ready to dismiss her as nothing more than another servant, another face in the crowd. But as she approached, something shifted in the air. Tasha's voice broke the silence, soft but firm, as she locked eyes with him. You can own all the buildings in this city, Mr. Langford, but that doesn't make you any more human than the person standing in front of you. Her words, though simple, hung in the air like a weight. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. James blinked, his smirk faltering, his sharp eyes narrowing as he tried to process the unexpected defiance. The room was dead silent, not a single person daring to speak. The waiters, the guests, the people who had been laughing and talking just moments ago, were now frozen, eyes wide, watching the scene unfold. Tasha stood tall, unwavering. There was no fear in her, only clarity. She had made a choice, and she would not back down. You don't know what it's like to be invisible, she continued, her voice still calm, though the words now carried more weight. You don't know what it's like to be dismissed, ignored, as if you don't matter. But I do. I live that every day, and tonight, you're going to remember that. Her words pierced the stillness. James stared at her, the cocky expression fading, his face slowly turning a shade darker. This wasn't the reaction he was used to. This wasn't how the world worked in his view. But tonight, the world had just shifted. The power balance had tilted, and the room that had been his stage was now hers. There was no applause, no cheers, but for the first time, James Langford was the one who felt small, the one who was being watched, the one who was out of place. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, something he couldn't understand. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick, until it was broken by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Elise Montgomery, sitting at a nearby table, stood up, her face red with indignation. You should be ashamed of yourself, she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She's right. We're all just people, and you don't get to treat her like that. The crowd, sensing the shift, murmured in agreement. James Langford shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure how to react. The power dynamic had changed, and he wasn't in control anymore. The moment passed, and Tasha walked away, her head held high, leaving a stunned room behind her. The restaurant that had once been a playground for the wealthy now felt like a place where something deeper was unfolding. James Langford, for the first time in years, wasn't sure who was winning anymore. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. Tasha Collins had just delivered her words, but it wasn't over. The restaurant, once filled with the soft clinking of glasses and polite conversations, now felt heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. James Langford sat there, his posture stiff, his usually unshakable confidence now faltering. It was as if time itself had stopped, and the bustling atmosphere had suddenly become an ominous backdrop to the real drama unfolding. As the moments passed, the room seemed to exhale collectively. But James wasn't ready to let go of his arrogance just yet. He was a billionaire, a man used to getting what he wanted, and he wasn't going to let some waitress, especially one like Tasha, make him feel small. He cleared his throat, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence that followed. "I didn't expect a lecture from someone in your position," he said, his voice sharp but lacking the usual bite. Tasha didn't flinch. She didn't need to. "Maybe you should start listening to people in my position," she replied quietly, her gaze unwavering. The room, which had been still as a painting, shifted uncomfortably. Some guests exchanged glances, unsure of whether to step in or not. But no one moved. Everyone was waiting, watching. James narrowed his eyes, but Tasha could see the flicker of uncertainty in his expression. This was new for him. Someone who didn't cower when faced with his wealth. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge his authority. And that realization did something strange to James. He had underestimated her from the moment she walked into the restaurant. But now, in front of all these people, he couldn't back down. He wanted to. He wanted to belittle her, to prove he was still in control, but the words got caught in his throat. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, almost begrudgingly. But Tasha was already walking away, her movements deliberate and composed. There was nothing more to prove. She had said her piece, and now she was letting the silence do the rest. As she moved toward the kitchen, her mind wasn't on the confrontation or the people still whispering behind her. She was focused on the weight of the moment, the way everything had shifted with just a few words. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back, but it didn't bother her. For once, she wasn't invisible. And that was enough. Back at the table, the tension hadn't entirely dissipated. Elise Montgomery, an influential businesswoman sitting nearby, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "It's about time someone said it." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the room like a knife. The eyes of the guests slowly turned toward James, whose face was a mask of frustration. He was used to being admired, to being the center of attention, but now, the energy in the room had shifted. The whispers were no longer about his success, his power, but about the woman who had just confronted him so calmly. James felt the weight of the stares, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, and he hated it. He was no longer the man in control. Tasha had turned the tables, and for the first time in a long time, he was the one who had to answer for his actions. As the night wore on, James' mind kept returning to the exchange. The sting of her words echoed in his thoughts. He wasn't used to feeling like this, unseen, unimportant, and vulnerable. He had the power, the wealth, the status, and yet, in that moment, Tasha had shown him something far more valuable: dignity. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze for James. The discussions at the table seemed distant, like they were happening in another world. He was no longer interested in the business deals, the mergers, or the praises that came with his success. All he could think about was Tasha, and, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure where he stood. His world, the world he had carefully constructed with money and power, suddenly felt fragile. The realization hit him hard. He had everything, and yet, he had just lost something far more important than any deal or investment. He had lost the respect of a woman who had nothing to prove but everything to say. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but in the back of his mind, one thing was clear: Tasha had changed something inside him. He had been taught a lesson he hadn't expected, one he wasn't sure how to process yet. But it was there, deep down, making him question everything he thought he knew about power and respect. By the time James left the restaurant, his world had been shaken. Tasha, in a single moment, had made him realize that the most valuable thing in the world wasn't wealth. It was the ability to stand tall, to speak the truth, and to be seen. James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. The night had ended, and the guests had all gone, but the echo of Tasha's words still lingered in his mind. He walked through the grand entrance of the restaurant, his steps slow and measured, as if the weight of the evening had settled heavily on his shoulders. The outside world, the buzzing of the city streets and the cool night air, didn't feel as familiar anymore. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. For someone like James Langford, a man who had built his empire with hard work, ruthless ambition, and an unyielding belief in his own superiority, this was a new experience. He was used to being admired, sought after, and revered. People trembled in his presence, respected his authority, and feared his power. Yet tonight, a simple waitress had challenged him, and in doing so, had made him question everything. As he slid into the back seat of his car, the hum of the engine seemed distant, muted. He glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing his own reflection staring back at him. It wasn't the face of the confident, powerful CEO he was used to seeing. Instead, it was the face of a man who had been blindsided. He knew the truth. Deep down, Tasha hadn't just stood up to him because of a small disagreement or a simple moment of defiance. She had done something far more significant. She had made him realize that no amount of wealth could shield him from the harsh reality of human dignity. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a man who had been taught a lesson in humility. The ride back to his penthouse felt longer than usual, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Tasha, her calm demeanor, her unwavering conviction. She had reminded him of something he had forgotten, something he had buried deep beneath his success and his empire: respect. When he arrived at his building, the towering skyscraper that had been his kingdom for so long, he almost didn't want to go inside. But he did, walking through the grand lobby, his usual air of superiority faltering for the first time in years. As he entered the elevator, he pressed the button for the top floor, his eyes lingering on the mirrored walls as they reflected the man he had become. But now, the man he saw wasn't the one he had built himself to be. He wasn't the untouchable mogul who could command the world with a single word. He was just a man, vulnerable, flawed, and searching for something more. When the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, James didn't immediately feel the rush of comfort and security he was accustomed to. The space that once felt like a symbol of his success now seemed cold and empty. He tossed his coat onto the couch and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. He gazed out at the lights, the endless sea of buildings, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Tasha had made him feel. She had treated him like a person, not a god. She had stood her ground, refused to bow to his wealth, and in doing so, had shown him a side of life he had long ignored. A side where kindness, integrity, and humility mattered more than status or money. The realization hit him with a force that was almost physical. He had spent so many years building his fortune, but at what cost? He had alienated people, lost friendships, and most importantly, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Tasha had reminded him of that. In the quiet of his penthouse, James felt something stir within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was powerful. It wasn't guilt or regret. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the beginning of change. For the first time in years, he wondered if it was possible to find a balance between success and humanity. Could he be both a powerful CEO and a man who respected others? Could he build his empire without losing himself in the process? He didn't know yet, but something told him that Tasha had planted a seed in his mind that he couldn't ignore. As he stood there, alone in his penthouse, James Langford realized that the most valuable thing he could ever possess wasn't money. It was the ability to respect and value the people around him. And in that moment, he made a promise to himself. He would change. Slowly, perhaps, but he would start. And it all began with a single woman who had shown him that power was nothing without respect. The morning after the dinner, James couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Tasha. He was used to being in control, used to navigating through the day with ease, but today felt different. Every phone call he took, every meeting he had, seemed distant and disconnected. His thoughts weren't with his deals, his acquisitions, or his empire. They were with her. Tasha had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, human, and that realization was unsettling. The sun poured through the windows of his penthouse, casting long shadows across the sleek furniture, but James barely noticed. His usual routine of checking emails, reviewing reports, and making phone calls felt almost mechanical. He was going through the motions, but nothing felt real. The city outside, with its hustle and bustle, its endless energy, suddenly seemed like a far-off world. The power he had once felt as an invincible businessman, the sense of control that had shaped his every decision, now seemed like a distant memory. He hadn't been this unsettled in a long time. Tasha's words, her calm demeanor, and the way she had stood up to him were like a mirror, reflecting back a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. He'd always prided himself on his ability to get what he wanted, to dominate the room, to make others bend to his will. But Tasha had done the opposite. She hadn't bent, hadn't flinched in the face of his insults. Instead, she had made him realize something that had been buried deep within him: respect. It wasn't something that could be bought with money, earned through deals, or commanded with power. It was something that had to be given, freely, without expectation. It was in that moment, as he sat in his office, surrounded by the very things that had once defined him, that he realized how much he had taken for granted. The wealth, the influence, the luxury, all of it had come at the cost of something far more valuable: genuine human connection. He had spent so many years building his empire, climbing higher and higher. But now, at the peak, he found himself looking down, wondering if it was all worth it. James ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping in. He had built this life from the ground up, but it had always been about power, about winning. And in that pursuit, he had lost sight of the people who mattered most. Those who didn't have the luxury of a seat at the table, those who were never seen as equals. But now, Tasha had made him question everything. He thought about her again, her quiet strength, the way she had stood in front of him without fear. She hadn't sought his approval. She hadn't needed anything from him. And that was the most powerful thing of all. He wasn't sure what to do with this newfound realization. He wasn't sure how to reconcile the man he had been with the man he wanted to become. But he knew one thing for certain: he had to change. James knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the years of arrogance and pride, but maybe, just maybe, he could start over. He could find a way to build his empire without sacrificing the values he had once lost sight of. The thought was daunting, but it also felt right. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from his assistant. There was a meeting scheduled with a potential partner, an important one that could lead to another lucrative deal. For most people, it would have been just another day at the office, another chance to expand the empire. But for James, it felt different now. He stared at the message for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Should he go through with the meeting? Should he continue down the path he had always followed? Or should he take a different route? The decision wasn't easy. He wasn't used to uncertainty. But, for the first time in a long time, James felt like he had a choice. And that feeling, the feeling of being able to choose his own path, was something he hadn't felt in years. He sighed, stood up from his desk, and walked to the window. The city was still out there, still bustling, still moving forward. But now, James felt like he was at a crossroads. He could keep chasing after the same old dreams, or he could forge a new path, one where respect and integrity mattered more than just the bottom line. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, he felt like it was worth the fight. He grabbed his coat, slipped it on, and made his way out of the penthouse. Today, he wasn't just going to be the CEO of Langford Enterprises. Today, he was going to start being the man he had always wanted to be. And that journey, he realized, was just beginning. The days following the dinner had been a whirlwind of introspection for James Langford. The events that had transpired in the restaurant had rattled him more than he cared to admit. The more he thought about Tasha's words, the more they resonated with him. He found himself questioning everything he had once held as true. For years, he had operated under the belief that success was defined by how much wealth and power one could amass, by how many people were forced to bend to your will. But now, after his encounter with Tasha, James wasn't so sure anymore. Was that truly success? Or had he been living in an illusion, one where respect and human connection had no place? It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be. His office, once a symbol of his achievements, now felt sterile, detached. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life: his wealth, his reputation, the respect he commanded. But that night, Tasha had shown him that true respect wasn't something to be demanded. It had to be earned. And he had failed in that regard. James knew it was time for a change. But where did he even begin? He had spent his entire life building this empire, this fortress of success, but it was all built on shaky ground. He had focused so much on the power that came with money and influence that he had lost sight of what truly mattered: the people. As the days passed, James decided that he wasn't going to let this realization pass by. He was going to make a change, and it would start with a step he never thought he would take: reaching out. Tasha had shown him what he needed to see, but it wasn't enough to simply think about it. He had to take action. He wasn't sure what he expected from this, but the desire to make things right, to make amends, was stronger than his pride. One afternoon, James found himself sitting in his office, drafting an email he never thought he'd write. "Dear Tasha," he began, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It felt odd, almost too personal, too vulnerable for a man who had built his career on remaining distant, on keeping everything at arm's length. "I want to start by saying thank you. You don't know me, and I didn't give you the respect you deserve, but your words have made me think about a lot of things. I can't undo what's been done, but I can try to be better. I don't know if this will make a difference, but I would like the chance to talk to you." He paused, staring at the screen. What was he even asking for? Forgiveness? Understanding? He wasn't sure, but he had to start somewhere. After a long moment of hesitation, he hit send. He sat back in his chair, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he felt exposed. He was used to being the one with the power, the one who controlled the narrative, but now, he was the one putting himself out there. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt right. The next few days were a blur. James kept himself busy with meetings and phone calls, but his mind always wandered back to Tasha. He wondered if she would respond, if she would even want to hear from him. He had no way of knowing how she would take it, but part of him hoped she would see his efforts as genuine. And then, one afternoon, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Tasha. James hesitated before opening it. His heart raced as he clicked on the message. "Mr. Langford," it began. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate your honesty. I'll be happy to meet with you, but I want you to know that respect isn't something I give lightly. If you want to talk, we can, but it will be on my terms." James felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. Ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to change. They set up a meeting for the following week, and when the day arrived, James found himself standing outside a small, unassuming coffee shop. It wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented, but it felt right. As he walked inside, he spotted Tasha sitting at a corner table, her presence calm and unassuming. She was exactly as he remembered, strong, composed, but with an air of quiet strength that he admired. He approached the table, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different this time, charged, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence that invited conversation, that allowed them both to breathe. James sat down, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. He simply listened, waiting for her to speak. Tasha was the first to break the silence. "I wasn't expecting this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I appreciate the effort. And I'll listen, but only if you're truly ready to hear." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm ready," he said quietly. And for the first time, he truly meant it. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. It wasn't about apologies or justifications. It was about honesty, about understanding. James found himself listening in a way he hadn't in years, really listening. And for the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand what it meant to truly respect someone, not because of their status or position, but because of their worth as a person. The conversation between James and Tasha unfolded slowly, like the careful unraveling of a tightly wound thread. James listened intently, hanging on every word she said, realizing just how much he had missed in the years he had spent focused solely on his wealth and power. Tasha spoke of her experiences, of the countless times she had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by people who assumed her worth based on her job or the color of her skin. But despite everything, she had always remained grounded, never allowing the world's judgment to define her. As she spoke, James found himself reflecting on his own life, his own choices, and the way he had treated people in the past. It wasn't just about Tasha now, it was about him. He had spent so long building his empire, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of success. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the most important thing. People. Real people. Not numbers on a spreadsheet or pawns in a business deal, but individuals with their own struggles, dreams, and stories. "I used to think that power was everything," James said after a long pause, his voice softer than usual. "I thought that if you had enough money, enough influence, you could make anyone do anything. But now, I'm not so sure. I've been so focused on winning that I've forgotten what it means to truly connect with people." Tasha nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's easy to get lost in all of that," she said, her tone gentle. "We all do at some point. But the thing is, no amount of money or power will ever give you the kind of respect you're looking for. Respect comes from how you treat people, how you see them, not as tools to get ahead, but as equals." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so many years using his wealth and position to control his world, to manipulate situations in his favor. But now, for the first time, he saw the cracks in that facade. Power without respect was empty. He couldn't ignore that truth anymore. "So what now?" James asked quietly, almost to himself. "How do I fix this? How do I undo all the damage I've caused?" Tasha paused, considering his question. "It's not about undoing anything. It's about moving forward," she said. "You can't change the past, but you can start making better choices from here on out. It's not going to be easy. You can't expect people to trust you overnight. But if you're genuine, if you show people that you see them for who they truly are, then maybe, just maybe, you'll start building something that lasts." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in a long time, James felt like he was on the verge of something real. The realization that power was not the answer, that respect and empathy were the keys to true success, hit him like a ton of bricks. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. The world he had been living in, the one where success was measured by how much money you had, by how many people you could control, was empty. It was a world that didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the kind of person he wanted to become, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. "I'm going to do better," James said, his voice steady, filled with a quiet determination. "I won't get it right all the time, but I'm going to try. I have to. For me. For the people around me." Tasha's expression softened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "That's all anyone can do," she replied. "Take it one step at a time." They sat there for a while, in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. James felt lighter somehow, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if he could ever truly make up for the mistakes of his past, but he knew this. He was ready to try. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was starting to understand what it meant to be human, to be kind, to treat people with the respect they deserved. It wasn't about the deals, the power, or the wealth. It was about how you made people feel, how you treated them when no one was watching. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything money could buy. Weeks passed, and the shift in James Langford's life became increasingly apparent. He had taken Tasha's words to heart, and with every passing day, he found himself applying them in small ways he had never considered before. His interactions with his employees, his colleagues, and even strangers felt different. He was more patient, more empathetic, and, above all, more aware of the people around him. At work, he started seeking input from those who had always been overlooked, the ones who had been too quiet, too afraid to speak up. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. James made a point of walking around the office more often, asking questions, genuinely listening to the answers. He found himself having conversations with his staff, not as a CEO giving orders, but as a person interested in their thoughts and ideas. It was uncomfortable at first. He had spent years building a wall around himself, creating a persona that was untouchable, unapproachable. But now he was knocking that wall down, piece by piece. And each piece that fell away revealed a different version of himself, one that he had buried under his wealth and ambition for far too long. Outside of work, James made an effort to show up in places where people didn't recognize him, places where he wasn't the CEO, the man with the power. He would go to small coffee shops, sit down, and strike up conversations with people who had no idea who he was. It was refreshing to be seen as just another person, not someone with expectations tied to his status. It reminded him of the simple joy of connecting with others, of being heard without any agenda. But the biggest change came in his approach to the relationships he had once taken for granted. James had always kept a tight circle, surrounding himself with people who could offer him something, whether it was influence, opportunity, or simply someone who would reaffirm his power. Now, he began reaching out to those who had supported him in the past, the friends and family who had always been there, but had never been a part of his elite world. One evening, he invited his older brother, Mark, to dinner at a small, unassuming restaurant, far from the luxurious spots he usually frequented. Over a simple meal, the conversation turned to their childhood, their parents, and the years that James had spent chasing success at the cost of their relationship. "I've missed this," Mark said quietly, glancing up from his plate. "It's been years since we just hung out like this. I never understood why you pushed everyone away." James shifted in his seat, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. "I thought I had to," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought that success meant leaving people behind, that I had to prove myself by cutting ties with everything that wasn't part of the picture I was building. But I was wrong." Mark's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. "You don't have to do it alone, James. You never did." Those words hit harder than anything James had heard in a long time. For years, he had isolated himself, convinced that being at the top meant doing it by himself. But in that moment, sitting across from his brother, James realized that the true strength came from the connections he made, not the empire he built. The following week, James reached out to his old friends from college, people he hadn't seen in years. He invited them to his office for lunch, not as the CEO, but as a man who wanted to reconnect. The lunch was casual, filled with laughter and stories about the old days. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, high-pressure meetings he was used to. It was real, raw, and reminded him of the person he used to be, the person he had almost lost in the pursuit of success. As he left the lunch meeting that day, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone. He was simply being himself. It was a small change, but it was significant. The foundation of his life, the very core of who he was, had shifted. He was no longer defined by his wealth or his status. He was defined by his actions, his relationships, and the respect he gave and received. One afternoon, as James sat in his office, reviewing a new business proposal, his assistant walked in with a message. It was from Tasha. He hadn't heard from her since their meeting, and he hadn't expected to. She had made it clear that respect needed to be earned, and he hadn't been sure if he had done enough to truly gain it. He opened the message, and his heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Langford," it began. "I've been thinking about our conversation. I wanted to let you know that I see the effort you've made. I see the changes, and I respect that." James read the message twice, the weight of her words settling over him. It wasn't a declaration of friendship or a promise of anything, but it was enough. It was acknowledgement. It was respect, and it was a step forward. He leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't about the deals, the acquisitions, or the boardrooms. It was about the relationships he had started to build, the ones that mattered, the ones that would last. And for the first time in a long time, James Langford felt like he was on the right path. The weeks that followed felt like a journey James Langford had never expected to take. He had spent so long at the top of his game, believing that power was the key to everything. But now he was learning what true power really meant. It wasn't in the boardrooms or in the size of his bank account. It was in how he treated people, how he showed up for them, and how he connected with the world around him. The changes were gradual, but they were there. He found himself laughing more, not out of nervousness or to assert dominance, but genuinely enjoying the company of those around him. At work, he started asking more questions, not just from his executives, but from everyone, from the assistant who answered the phone to the interns in the back offices. James was learning how to truly listen, how to value the opinions of others, and for the first time, he was feeling less alone. Tasha's words had stayed with him. Respect needed to be earned, and he wasn't going to gain it through money, status, or manipulation. He had to show people he cared, not because it would benefit him, but because it was the right thing to do. Pitch. He couldn't shake the feeling that the people on the other side weren't being entirely transparent. It was a moment that could have easily slipped by in his old life, a moment where he would have accepted the deal and moved forward, focusing only on the numbers. But now, he was listening with a different kind of awareness. He was paying attention to the way the people in the room acted, to their body language, to the subtleties they were trying to hide behind their polished presentations. James had been in the business long enough to know when something didn't sit right. He spoke up, asking questions he would have ignored before, digging deeper into the specifics of the partnership. It wasn't about being difficult or trying to outsmart the other side. It was about making sure that everything was above board, that the deal was fair, and that no one was taking advantage of anyone else. The room fell silent for a moment. The executives around him exchanged uncertain glances, But James didn't back down. He had learned that his reputation wasn't just built on how much money he could make. It was built on how much integrity he brought to the table. By the end of the meeting, the deal had been adjusted, some of the more questionable terms had been removed, and both parties left the table with a renewed sense of trust. It was a small victory, but it was one that meant more to James than any dollar amount. He walked out of that meeting feeling proud of himself, not because he had outplayed anyone, but because he had done the right thing. For the first time in years, he felt like he had made a decision that reflected who he wanted to be, not just who he had been. That evening, as he sat at his desk, the weight of the day lifting off his shoulders, James couldn't help but think about how far he had come. He had spent so much of his life chasing the idea of success, but now he understood that success wasn't just about achievements or accolades. It was about the journey, the choices you made along the way, and the relationships you built. As he reflected on all that had happened in the past few months, James realized that he had found a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just the CEO of Langford Enterprises anymore. He was someone who could make a real difference in the lives of the people around him, someone who could use his power for good. It was a quiet moment, but one that carried a weight of its own. James had started to see the world in a different way, and it was a perspective he was determined to keep. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But now, he felt ready for them. He had learned that true strength came from humility, that true success came from respect, and that the best way to build something lasting was to treat people with the dignity they deserved. They felt different. He had a new perspective. James had spent so many years building walls around himself, keeping people at a distance to protect his image, to protect his version of success. But now, he wanted to break those walls down, one conversation at a time, reconnecting with his old friends, the ones he had lost touch with over the years.